Welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. We always try to dig into those parts of history that are a little bit shrouded in mystery, maybe even a little bit misunderstood. And today we're going to be talking about sorcery in the Caribbean. It's something that's always, kind of been whispered about, kind of feared.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area. And in this deep dive, we're going to be really taking a closer look at voodoo and empire, unmasking the sorcery of the Caribbean. And I think one of the things that's really important to remember is that all of this is set against this backdrop of the transatlantic slave trade.
Of course, right.
Yeah.
I mean, these belief systems didn't just come out of nowhere. They were shaped by the experiences of those who were enslaved and brought to the Caribbean.
Exactly. And, as we go through this, you'll see how voodoo and obeah, they're often kind of lumped together, but they actually have their own distinct histories and evolutions. And it's particularly interesting to look at how they played out in places like Haiti and Jamaica.
And we've got some pretty incredible sources for this deep dive.
Hmm.
Historical accounts, missionary writings, which, have their own perspective, colonial records, and even observations from travelers and residents who actually witnessed these practices firsthand.
Yeah, a real mix of perspectives, which is always important. And, what we really want to do with this deep dive is go beyond just the sensationalism, the kind of spooky stories, and really understand how these practices were perceived historically, how they changed over time, and maybe most importantly, what they meant for the people who practiced them, especially in the context of, colonial power and resistance.
So we're going to be challenging some assumptions today.
Absolutely.
All right. So let's start with how Europeans first encountered these traditions. And, from what I've read, it doesn't seem like they were exactly met with open arms.
Well, yeah, I mean, you have to remember the context here. These early European observers, they were coming from a completely different worldview. And anything that didn't fit into their understanding of the world, it was often just dismissed as, weird, eerie, even dangerous.
Right. And our sources really show how the terms voodoo and obeah were used pretty interchangeably by Europeans. They didn't really differentiate between the specifics of the practices.
It's like if it seems strange or mysterious, it was all just lumped together under this umbrella of otherness. And that, it was a way of dismissing the beliefs and practices of enslaved Africans.
And this lack of understanding, this fear of the unknown, it really comes through in some of the early accounts. Like we see it in Dr. Price Mars's critique of Seabrook's depiction of voodoo ceremonies in Haiti.
Ah, yes. Price Mars, a Haitian scholar, really called out Seabrook on some pretty significant inaccuracies in his account. Like in Seabrook's description of the Petro sacrifice, he talks about a bull being sacrificed. But Price Mars points out that in Petro rituals, the proper sacrificial animal is actually a pig, not a bull.
That's a pretty big difference.
Yeah, it really raises questions about how much Seabrook actually understood or even witnessed of these ceremonies. It suggests that maybe he was more interested in telling a sensational story than in accurately portraying voodoo.
So it's almost like he was playing up the exoticism for his European audience.
Exactly. And this wasn't just Seabrook. This kind of sensationalism, this bias, it's something we see again and again in early European accounts of African spiritual practices. And it's tied to this broader tendency to categorize these practices under the label of fetishism.
Right. And, fetishism was basically this catch-all term that Europeans used to describe anything they saw as, primitive or superstitious. It was this idea that, African religions were all about worshiping objects, charms, amulets, that kind of thing.
And of course, that completely misses the point, right?
Yeah.
It ignores the complex theologies, the cosmologies, the deep spiritual meaning behind these practices.
It reduces it down to just the superficial.
Exactly. And speaking of reducing things down, our sources have some pretty fascinating information about serpent worship in West Africa, specifically in Ouidah, which was a major slave trading port in Dahomey.
Oh, yeah, I read about that. The reverence they had for these snakes was incredible. They had temples, rituals, even priests dedicated to taking care of them.
Yeah, and it wasn't just, a casual respect. I mean, even accidentally harming one of these snakes could lead to some pretty serious consequences. There are stories of people being punished, even killed, for hurting these snakes.
It's wild. And this is where things get really interesting, because there's a strong connection between this West African serpent worship and the development of voodoo in Haiti.
Yeah, that's one of the key takeaways here. The reverence for snakes, particularly a specific harmless species, is seen as a major root of Haitian voodoo. And you see this connection directly in figures like Dambala, Aloha in Haitian voodoo, who's often associated with the serpent. His name actually comes from the Dahomen deity Dambialada.
So enslaved people from this region brought these beliefs with them to the Caribbean.
Exactly. They held on to their spiritual traditions, adapted them to their new environment. And it's important to remember that, the serpent itself wasn't necessarily the ultimate object of worship. It was
No.
often seen as a medium, a connection to a higher power.
So it's not just about worshiping a snake, it's about something bigger.
Exactly. It's about accessing the divine through this powerful symbol.
And speaking of powerful symbols, we need to talk about obeah. Our sources suggest it was a very different kind of practice, often associated with sorcery and healing.
Yeah, obeah is interesting because it's generally considered a more individualistic practice. It's often linked to manipulating occult forces to achieve specific aims, things like healing, protection, even causing harm. And its origins are traced back to West Africa as well. But this time, the connection is to enslaved people from the Gold Coast, particularly the Ashanti.
I read about some of the tools and techniques that were associated with obeah practitioners. It sounds like something straight out of a dark fairy tale: feathers, bones, grave dirt, incantations, even knowledge of poisonous plants.
Yeah, there's definitely a sense of mystery and even danger surrounding obeah. And it seems like obeah men and women held a lot of power and influence within the slave communities.
But was that power always based on, actual evidence? Or could some of it have been fueled by fear and the colonial authorities playing up that fear to maintain control?
Well, it's probably a bit of both. I mean, some accounts do emphasize the use of poisons and the manipulation of fear as central to obeah. And the colonial authorities definitely used that fear to their advantage. But it's also likely that obeah practitioners genuinely held a certain degree of spiritual knowledge and power within their communities.
And it wasn't always used for negative purposes, right?
Right. While many European accounts focus on the more sinister aspects of obeah, it's important to remember that within the enslaved communities, obeah practitioners likely also served as healers, providers of spiritual guidance, and sources of protection.
So it's a more nuanced picture than just, pure evil sorcery.
Exactly. It's about understanding the complexity of these practices and the different roles they played within the lives of enslaved people.
Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about voodoo in Haiti. It seems like it took on a unique character there.
Yes. In Haiti, voodoo went through this fascinating process of what we call syncretism, which is basically the blending of different religious or cultural traditions, in this case, traditional African religions, particularly those of the Fon people from Dahomey, blended with aspects of Catholicism to create something truly unique.
Right. And we see that the Homan influence in the concept of Loa, which are these powerful spirits or intermediaries in Haitian voodoo.
Yeah, the Loas are central to Haitian voodoo. Think of them as forces of nature, each with their own personality and domain. And we see the Dahomen connection again in figures like Dambala, who's linked to the serpent, and whose name comes from the Dahomen deity Dangbi Alada.
So it's like these threads of belief are weaving together across time and space.
Exactly. And it's not just about belief. Our sources also talk about the role of voodoo in slave resistance, specifically mentioning the Boukman Rebellion and the Cayman Wood Ceremony.
That sounds pretty intense.
It was. The Cayman Wood Ceremony was this pivotal event in 1791, led by Boukman, a voodoo priest. According to accounts, it involved a gathering of enslaved people where they took oaths and sacrificed a black pig. Many historians believe this ceremony served as a spiritual rallying point for the Haitian Revolution.
So voodoo wasn't just a religion. It was a force for social and political change.
Absolutely. In the context of slavery, these religious gatherings provided a space for the enslaved to connect, to resist, to fight for their freedom. The spiritual and the political were inseparable.
Now, we have to address a pretty controversial aspect of Haitian voodoo, the claims of human sacrifice and cannibalism.
Yeah, this is where things get really tricky and, frankly, disturbing. There were figures like Sir Spencer St. John who made some pretty outlandish claims about these practices being widespread, even suggesting that cannibalism was brought to Haiti by enslaved Africans.
But those claims were met with a lot of skepticism.
Right. Absolutely. Scholars like Dr. Price-Mars strongly refuted many of these claims, pointing out the lack of evidence and the potential for bias and exaggeration. While isolated incidents may have occurred, the idea that human sacrifice and cannibalism were central tenets of voodoo is largely unsubstantiated and likely fueled by fear and misinformation.
So we have to be very careful about taking those claims at face value.
Exactly. It's our responsibility to present these claims as they appear in the historical record, but without endorsing them or sensationalizing them.
Okay, let's move on to Jamaica now and talk about Maoism and obeah.
Hmm.
Our sources present them as distinct, even opposing forces.
Yeah, that's one of the interesting things about Jamaica. You have Maoism, which was a more community-oriented practice rooted in Ashanti tribal religion. It was about healing, protection, and maintaining a connection to the ancestors.
And the Mile dance was central to Maoism, right?
Yeah, the Mile dance was a key ritual. It was a communal event full of music, dancing, and spiritual energy. It was a way of connecting with the ancestors, honoring the spirits, and reinforcing social bonds within the community.
So how did Maoism compare to obeah? Was it seen as a force for good?
Well, historically, there was this antagonism between Mile men, also known as Okomfo, that's an Ashanti term for priest, and obeah-men, or Obaifo, meaning witch in Ashanti. Mile practitioners often saw themselves as counteracting the perceived harm caused by obeah.
So it was like a spiritual battle playing out within the slave communities.
Exactly. But they weren't always completely separate. They might use similar methods, herbs, rituals, that kind of thing, but with different intentions. Nihilism was more focused on the well-being of the community, while obeah was often seen as serving individual interests.
And then there was the suppression of traditional African religious assemblies by the colonial authorities. How did that impact both Maoism and obeah?
Well, it made it much harder for nihilism to flourish. The Okomfo traditionally operated within a community context, but these legal restrictions forced them to be more secretive, and that kind of created more space for obeah, which had always been a more clandestine practice.
So the colonial authorities, in trying to suppress these practices, might have actually inadvertently strengthened obeah.
It's possible. They certainly made it harder for the community to collectively resist the influence of obeah.
And over time, both voodoo and obeah evolved, right?
Of course, they were constantly adapting to the changing circumstances. We see syncretism happening, like the incorporation of Catholic elements into voodoo in Haiti, and there are even instances of voodoo elements like serpent worship, influencing perceptions of obeah in other contexts.
And what about the revivalist movements that emerged in Jamaica? How did those connect to older traditions like Maoism?
There's a good argument to be made that Maoistic traditions found new expression within these Christian revivalist contexts. Movements like Bedwardism, with their emphasis on spiritual possession and ecstatic rituals, show potential continuities with Maoism, albeit within a Christian framework.
So it's not like these traditions just disappear. They were reshaped, reinterpreted, but they persisted.
Exactly, and that's what makes this whole subject so fascinating. It's about understanding the resilience of these traditions, how they adapted and evolved in response to oppression, cultural exchange, and the changing social landscape.
And what about today? Our sources suggest that voodoo and obeah beliefs are still present in the Caribbean, despite all the attempts to suppress them.
Absolutely. While the overt practice may have diminished in some areas, the underlying beliefs and influences persist. You can still see their traces in various forms of Caribbean culture, from music and art to oral traditions and healing practices.
It's like they're woven into the very fabric of the Caribbean.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important for us to understand these practices within their historical context, to move beyond the stereotypes and the sensationalism.
So this deep dive has really been about unmasking the sorcery of the Caribbean, about understanding the complex interplay of African religious traditions, slavery, colonialism, and the resilience of cultural identity.
It's about recognizing the power of belief and the ways in which people find meaning and connection, even in the face of unimaginable adversity. And as we conclude, we want to leave you with this thought. How profoundly did the horrific experience of slavery shape not only the lives, but also the very spiritual beliefs of enslaved Africans?
And how do those beliefs continue to resonate today?
It's a question worth pondering, and if you're interested in exploring further, we encourage you to dive into the history of the transatlantic slave trade, the cultures of West Africa, and the diverse expressions of Afro-Caribbean religions as they exist today.
Because there's so much more to uncover, so much more to learn.